I want us to do something basic, and then we will advance progressively. And I'm saying I want us to look at the history of the 7 churches. So, and I'm going to wish it would be an interactive class for us. So I'll be asking a few questions, but I'm saying if you feel like you can shout out the answer, I have no problem. I love chorus answers for my classes. So, which book do we actually find the history of the 7 churches? If you have an answer, you can just say it. Anyone? You can just unmute and say. I hope we won't have that commotion where people will speak at a go. Anyone? So someone says the Revelation. I agree. Which chapter?
Okay.
Yes? Someone is speaking? So, okay, someone says 2 and 3. So I just want us to refresh our minds. I want us to go to the book of Revelation, and I want us to go to Revelation chapter 1. So I just want to pick a concept from Revelation chapter 1. So someone says 1 to 3. I would agree with that. So Revelation chapter 1. So just to give the context of the story. So this is John the Revelator, and John is in the Isle of Patmos. He's one of the last disciples. So, and John, while in the Isle of Patmos, this is a prisoner for the hard cause. Like the most violent criminals are in prison in this island of Patmos. So they saw John as an enemy of because of the gospel he was teaching, and they tried to kill him, boiling him in a basin of hot oil. He couldn't die, so they chose to banish him into the Isle of Patmos, assuming he would suffer and die. But while in the Isle of Patmos, John has a revelation. So I'm not going to read the first verse, but it gives the protocol. It's the revelation of Christ given by God, that is to Christ, to show unto his servants things that must shortly come to pass. So you have the first person of the Godhead, and then you have Christ, and then you have the servants. It's a protocol of 3. But there is a proxy in between, because he says, he signified and sent it by his angel unto his servant John. So this revelation of Christ will be sent via an angel to John the servant, to John to reach the servants. So then there is a blessing upon those who read and those who hear the words. So when you read verse 4, so this is John who is told, right? So someone is talking. I don't know. Someone needs to mute. So thank you. Mute. I hope you can hear me now. So I'm saying, when you go to Revelation chapter 1, verse 4, okay? Okay, can you hear me now? So I'm saying, when you go to the story of John in Revelation chapter 1, I want us to see that John will see something. And this is around verse 10, where he says, I was in spirit on the Lord's day, and heard behind me a great voice as of a trumpet. So I want us to picture John. And John, it's on the Lord's day, and he's going to hear a voice, the voice of a trumpet. And this voice is going to say, I am Alpha and Omega, first and last. And what thou seest, write in a book, and send it unto the 7 churches which are in Asia. So whatever John is going to see, John is told, whatever you see or whatever you hear, please do what? Write and send it unto the 7 churches which are in Asia. So, and you're going to see that there are 7 churches in Asia. So I will draw a line here. So, and I will name the 7 churches. The first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth church, sixth church, and the 7th church. So what John is told to do is to write whatever he sees, a message to the 7 churches. And when you look at the churches, the first church is Ephesus. The second one is Smyrna. The third one is Pergamos. The fourth one is Thyatira. The fifth one is Sardis. The sixth one is Philadelphia. And then Laodicea is the 7th church. So John is commissioned to write some information to these 7 churches in Asia. So verse 12, and John turns to see the voice that spake to him. So this is the voice of the trumpet. And being turned, John sees 7 golden candlesticks. So John hears a voice, and when he hears the voice, he turns to look, and what John saw is 7 golden candlesticks. So I want to draw 7 golden candlesticks. So these are the 7 candlesticks. Seven of them. So when John turns, John sees 7 golden candlesticks. And then the story continues. And in the midst of the 7 candlesticks, one like unto the Son of Man. So in the midst of the candlestick, there is one like unto the Son of Man. So I want to mark the middle here across, present the one who is in the midst of the 7 candlesticks. I think someone is still unmuted. I would ask please to avoid that background noise. You please mute your mics. I don't know who. So I'm saying, when John turns to look at the voice, he sees 7 candlesticks, and in the midst, someone there. And the verse says, and his head, so from verse 14 and until verse 16, John is going to describe to us how the one who is in the midst of the candlestick looks like. And I'm interested more on part B of verse 16. Out of his mouth went a sharp 2-edged sword, and his countenance was as the sun shining in strength. So as this person John describes, John is telling us that out of his mouth is a 2-edged sword. So John gives us the description of what he saw. And John will react to what he sees in verse 17. And then the voice continues, fear not, I am the first and the last. I am he that liveth and was dead. So verse 19, write the things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. So John is not told, write what you have seen. And what has John seen? What is that is in the present are the things which also will come in future. And then he's told the mystery of the 7 stars which you saw in my right hand, the 7 and the 7 candlesticks. He's told the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 candlesticks which you saw are the 7 churches. So when you look at this story, you know that actually Christ, the 7 candlesticks, these are the churches. And each church has a star. And these are the angels of the 7 churches. So the 7 stars are the angels of the churches. So, and the point out, chapter 2, I'm suggesting that chapter 2 is a repeat and enlarge of chapter 1. And I will explain how. So when John saw someone speaking in the midst of the candlesticks, I'm suggesting that the words that this someone is talking, that the Son of Man is talking, the verse says, out of his mouth issued a two-edged sword. So there is some information, there is a message or words coming out of the one in the midst of the sticks. And I'm suggesting bringing the pictorial representation. Whatever Christ is doing, Christ is addressing the angels of the 7 churches. And if you want to know what words he's addressing the angels of the 7 churches, these are the words we see in chapter 2. So in chapter 2 from verse 1, you will see, and to the angel of church of Ephesus, write. So Christ will be addressing each candlestick. And so when John sees someone in the midst of the candlestick, and out of his mouth issuing some information, the information issuing out is this information that is in chapter 2. And what Christ is doing, he's addressing each church, and it's through each angel. So, unto the angel of the first church, or unto the angel of the first candlestick, second, third, fourth. So I'm suggesting chapter 2 and chapter 3 can all be squeezed inside this verse 16. Out of his mouth issued a two-edged sword, and whatever the two-edged sword is the entire information in chapter 2 and 3 given to the angels of the 7 churches. I hope you get that point. So when you go to chapter 2 now, you know that this is Christ actually addressing each angel. And I'm not going to discuss this in details because I'm saying Christ will be able to describe the condition of each church, the good things they have done, the sufferings they have undergone, and also the bad things or where they have failed. And you will actually see that of all the 7 churches, there is actually one church that Christ will not find a fault with. Let me see those who have read. Which church did Christ not found any fault with? Okay, someone is raising a hand here. So first, look those who are online, and then anyone, you can shout the answer.
Church Philadelphia.
Okay, someone is saying Philadelphia. Okay, Rispa, your church is okay, 6. So this is Church Philadelphia. It's the only good church. Even Ephesus have lost their first love. So this is the history of the 7 churches. And another important bit of information that I want us to see is that when you look at the history of the 7 churches, or what we understand in the movement as the history of the 7 churches, it has also been parallel with the history of the 7 seals. So you're going to realize that the 7 churches run parallel with the history of the 7 seals. So what you will realize is that the 7 churches will explain to us what is happening inside the church, the internal history of the church. And the history of the 7 seals will explain to us what is happening externally. This is the external history of how the church interacts with the world. Internal history is the history of the church within the church. So if I would give a dynamic, you will actually see for the first church, Ephesus, they will explain to us what is happening inside the church of that era. If Paul interacts with brethren in Corinth, in Galatia, wherever Paul goes, they will tell us of the advancement of the gospel inside the church. But when you come to the 7 seals, it will explain to us how this church in its entirety interacts with the kingdoms, specifically in Rome, because Rome is the kingdom that rules in this era. So when you look at the history of the seals, you actually realize the first church is paralleled with the white horse. And the second church minor is paralleled with which horse? Which is the second seal? Someone can shout the answer? Which is the second seal? Anyone?
Red.
Yes.
The pale one.
The pale. Someone is saying the pale. No, not the pale.
The red one.
Good. Exactly. The second horse is the red horse. And what is the third horse? Yes? Someone?
The black horse.
Then you have the black horse. And then the fourth horse is the pale horse. And what we are going to see is that this is also a reminder, is that when you come to the history of the churches, we are going to see a very interesting pattern, that the first 4 churches have a pattern we call a cause and effect relationship. So the first 4 churches have a cause and effect relationship. What do I mean by that? You'll actually see the first church, Ephesus. This is depicted by the white horse, and white is actually the church in its purity. The one who rides on the first horse, which is the white horse, has a bow and an arrow, which represents the gospel, and he goes forth conquering and to conquer. And this actually represents the success of the first Christian church, the early Christian church. And because of them being a good church, the church in its purity, Ephesus means a desirable church. Because Ellen White, in Acts of the Apostles 5:85, I'm not going to read, but you can read it for yourself. Acts of the Apostles 5:85. I think it's from paragraph 2 onwards. She's going to give us the explanation or the commentary about the history of the churches. And you will realize that the names of the churches represents the character of church. So the word Ephesus means desirable. And so this is a desirable church. It's the church in its purity, represented by the white horse, which goes forth conquering and to conquer. The second horse, this is Smyrna, and this is the church under persecution. So this is the church under persecution. And so the cause and effect relationship that you will actually see is that the first church, because of being a desirable church, this is the cause. Being good, the effect is that the church will be subjected into persecution. And as it is common, you will realize that after the church has been subjected into persecution, or as human beings, sometimes are pushed into a corner, what they end up doing is to compromise. This is the black horse, the church under compromise. The one who rides on this horse, the black horse, has a pair of balance. One side is wheat, the other side is barley. And it's one measure of wheat for a penny and 3 measures of barley for a penny. So 1 penny can buy you 1 measure of wheat, and the same penny can buy you 3 measures. And what did you expect people to choose? It's 1 penny for 3 measures. And this pair of balance shows us it's all about compromise. This is church Pergamos, where Satan's seat is. This is the church of God when they amalgamate truth and error. We will at least speak about this church in a little while. Then you come to the 4th church, and this is the church in the apostate history, the church under the period of darkness. And this church, the Atera, is represented by the pale horse. And the one who rides on this pale horse is going to bring death and hell. This is the church in the dark ages. And this church, the Atera, is the church that exists in the period of the 1260. So if I would put dates roughly on this timeline here, we would be able to justify, I'm not going to do that this is the church that begins with the works of the apostles. Most people would go for 31 AD, but I will suggest even John the Baptist plays a role in establishing the foundation of this church. He's actually baptizing people into a new faith. He's actually teaching a foundational gospel that will be spread the same gospel by the disciples. So you would actually show John also this one. Now, it's simple. I just put that one. So someone is still someone. I think it's Aden. Please, Aden. Aden,
Boba Job. Anybody to mute Adeng Ama remove her? Somebody there, because she's not listening.
Okay. I hope next time we'll not allow people to talk because some are unmuting unaware. I don't know. So I'm saying when you look at the history of these churches now,
mute please.
Being under persecution, they will end up being subjected into a compromised state. So because of persecution, this is Emperor Constantine. And what you realize, Emperor Constantine, I still can hear them. Now it's Ali Angang. Anyway, so when you look at the 3rd church, Church Pergamos, it's as a result of what happens in the history of Church Minor. This is from 100 AD to 320s. After the 10 years of persecution by the current emperor called Diocletian, you will actually see that the incoming emperor, who will be now the Constantine we know, he will try to broker a deal with the church. They want to end persecution, and he's more than willing and ready to convert to Christianity. And this seems as a positive move for the church to convert a pagan. But what they fail to realize is that with him, he will carry the baggage of paganism. And within no time, the church will find itself into the same compromised state. where they have a mixture of truth, their beliefs, and this paganism or pagan practices which are introduced by these new converts. And this becomes the church of compromise. And you are going to see this first church here, because of being a good church, it's the work of Satan, or it's Satan who will punish this church. The first church, Ephesus, because of being good, Satan, through his own agencies, Rome, will persecute this church. And then you will see, because of this church facing persecution, they will be subjected into compromise to end persecution. And the moment they compromise, now they make enmity with God. And because of this compromise, God will suffer them to go into this period of darkness. And so you will realize this church will now be subjected by God to punishment. So you'll actually see the first two churches have a cause and effect. The third and the second have a cause and effect, and the third and the fourth also have a cause and effect. So progressing from church number 1 to church number 4, you have a cause and effect relationship. So going to the fifth seal, you'll actually see in the history of the fifth seal, you have the cries of the martyrs. They are crying for their vengeance, and they are told to wait for a little while. So we know this church Sardis, this is the church of Protestants. These are the Protestants who protest against the oppression of the Catholic Church in the history of the Dark Ages. So this is Church of Protestantism. And this is where we have many martyrs who are going to cry for the blood of those who are killed in the period of the Dark Ages. Then you go to Church Philadelphia, and what is depicted in this church, these are the signs. Externally, you can see the signs of the coming of the Son of Man. Speaks of the dark days, speak of the falling of the stars, and speaks of the angering of the nations. It's the history of Church Philadelphia. That's what's happening externally. Then for Laodicea, what you have is silence in heaven. So this is the history of the 7 seals and the 7 churches. And you can put Church Pergamos until 538. From 538 to 1798, you have Church Sardis, but there is an overlap here. You can also mark to the 1830s when Miller begins to teach and healing people from Church Sardis. Ellen White puts Laodicea beginning in 1850s. And you'd say this to the Second Advent. So another important point that I want us to see. So there is a cause and effect. So the other point I want us to see is that as Ellen White speaks in the quote Acts of the Apostles, this is the history of the 7 churches. So there are 7 churches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So these are 7 churches. But Ellen White will tell us that they are not actually 7 churches, but this is one church. This is one church in her 7 forms, or what you would call periods, or what you would call ages. So this is one church which we are going to call God's church. And this church will undergo 7 transformations. So there is a time this church is desirable, a good church. There is a time this church faces persecution. There is a time this church, one church, compromises. There is a time this church goes into punishment by God. There is a time they come out of that punishment. There is a time they are so desirable, there is no mistake in them. And then there is a time the church becomes terrible, that God desires to pull the church out of the mouth. So this is just one church. You can read this from Acts of the Apostles. And so the harmony that I want us to see, despite John writing a message to the 7 churches in Asia, there are actually 7 literal churches in Asia. But this is a parable. It's an information given to the 7 churches which existed in Asia, but that is a message given to a people living at the end of the world to understand the 7 dispensations that God's church has undergone. So another important point I also want us to note. So I'm just trying to refresh our minds. So what you will see is that when you come to the history of Church Laodicea, you will actually see that Church Laodicea, so Philadelphia, this is the Millerite church. And the Laodicean church, this is the Seventh-day Adventist church. And I want us to see that Church Laodicea can be paralleled to Church Sardis. So can someone give me a reason why I'm equating Church Laodicea to Church Sardis? Anyone? I will ask someone to speak. Someone to give me a reason why I'm equating Church Sardis. Benta, can you tell me why I'm equating the Laodicean church, which I'm saying this is the Seventh-day Adventist church, and equating it to Church Sardis, which is the Protestant church? This is just refreshment. We are just revising. Yes? Benta, you have an idea? Okay. General, why am I equating the 2 churches together? Okay. Jackie, I hope people can hear me. Jackie, you have an idea?
What are you saying, Muriuki?
I'm saying Church Laodicea is the same as Church Sardis. I'm asking why. Why am I equating them together?
Church Sardis and Laodicea. Let me think about it.
Okay. Titus?
Hello, Muriuki, this is Brian. I think.
Okay,
we were
Brian.
supposed to- Okay. It's okay. It's okay. I haven't currently, as at now, read verses that are describing Church Laodicea, but from my bias, past information idea, I know Church Laodicea has been described as being hot and cold.
Yes.
So I am looking at the verses describing Sardis, but I'm coming with the predetermined the pre idea I have about Church Laodicea, so that I can see the comparison in the descriptions given for Sardis. But I think maybe as I'm looking to the exact verse, I have found thy works perfect before God.
So you've forgotten.
Yes, verse 1. So I read verse 1.
Okay.
And as the angel of the church in Sardis, right, these things said he that had the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. I know thy works, that thou hast a name, that thou livest and art dead. So I'll pick those verses, those words describing the church from the second part of the verse number 1. The second part says, I know thy works, that thou hast a name, that thou livest and art dead. So that is the point, the similarity I'm seeing. So it's the similarity I'm seeing between Church Sardis and Laodicea, that they are in
So,
the same condition. In
Okay.
church, nowadays in Sardis, it's being described as being as living and being in a dead state. And I think it's a repeat and enlarge in verse 4, which says, is it verse 4? Is I think verse 5, yes. Okay, I leave it there. I leave it there. Hot and cold, living and dead.
Okay, thank you. So the reason why I'm equating them together is because the Laodicean church, they claim to be hot, but what are they? They are cold. Actually, when you come to church Sardis, they claim to have a name that lives, so they claim to be alive. But are dead. I hope this is the death I'm speaking about is the spiritual death. So Sardis and Laodicea have the same character, hypocrisy. They are actors, they are pretenders. This is what they actually are, but this is what they claim to be. And they try to bring that lukewarm situation, having hot and cold, but their real condition is cold. Their real situation is dead, but they claim to be alive. So these two churches have parallels actually. And so they also have another characteristic. So, and for you to know this characteristic, I want to read a quote for you. If you can get it, this is Review and Herald. It's November 1st, 1850. I don't know the paragraph, but the quote again is in Early Writings, page 74, paragraph 1. So someone can read to us Early Writings, which is the easier one to access. The reason why I went to Review and Herald, because it's going to identify the what? It's going to identify the actual date when Ellen White is writing this. So if you are there, you can read that for us, please. The first paragraph of Early Writing 74. Anyone?
It reads
Yes.
74, paragraph 1. The title is The Gathering Time.
Okay, so the title is The Gathering Time. So that's the title.
Yes, so it says, September 23rd, the Lord showed me that he had stretched off their hand the second time to recover the remnant of their people, and that efforts must be redoubled in this gathering time. In the scattering, Israel was smitten and torn, but now in the gathering time, God will heal and bind their people. In the scattering, efforts made to spread the truth had but little effect accomplished, but little or nothing. But in the gathering, when God has set their hand to gather their people, efforts to spread the truth will have their designed effect. All should be
Thank you.
united and zealous. Okay.
That's okay. So this is September, but the quote is published in November now. The Lord showed me. So when you look at the original quote, this is the year 1850. And I'm saying from the year 1850, the Lord wants to do what? To stretch hand a second time to recover the remnant of his people. So this is from 1850, and I'm saying this is a period of gathering, and I'm going to write it G. But Ellen White says a second time, so this is gathering two, if I would put it that way. The Lord has stretched his hand a second time. And from that one single statement, you can generate a lot of information. How do you do it? It's the realization, if this is gathering two, if the Lord has stretched the hand to gather, it means in the previous dispensation, these people were in a what? In a scattering. Are we together? And if this is a gathering a second time, then there must be a gathering the first time. And so I would put gathering 1 here. So this is gathering 2. And I would continue the pattern. If they have been gathered the first time, they must have been scattered the first time. And I'm going to put this as scattering 1. So they were scattered the first time, and then they were gathered. They were scattered again, and then they were gathered. And we will eventually see that after having an attempt of a gathering, they will not actually be gathered because they will end up having another scattering. I would call it scattering 1, scattering 2. Now this becomes scattering 3. And if they were scattered at that time, they must be gathered at that time. So what you eventually have is such a pattern. 3 gatherings and 3 scatterings, just from one quote. You can generate that information. And now I will help you fill the dates. If this is 1850, when God is going to gather them a second time, when were they scattered? Kuto, if they were to be gathered in 1850, Kuto, when were they scattered? Yes? Kuto, you're not audible? I can't hear what Kuto is saying. Okay.
He's typing.
Yes?
He's saying 1844.
1844, okay. So they must have been scattered in October 22nd, 1844. This is after the Great Disappointment, where Ellen White says this was a period of uncertainty, and people are scattered. Of over 200,000 that existed in this movement, they will be dispersed. Only a handful will remain in the faith. And if October 22nd is when the scattering began, then you can show that from 1798 is when they began their gathering 1. October, they are going to be scattered. Now 1850, they have their gathering 2. And if 1798 is when they were to be gathered, then you can mark their scattering from 538 to 1798. And this is the history of Church Thyatira. I hope you can see that. So I hope you can see that. It's this history of Church Thyatira when God is punishing them, where I would put punishment stroke scattering. So in this period, the 12 of 60 years, it's the period of the church of God under punishment from God because of compromise, or the period of scattering. I hope you can see that. And then you would show from 1798 to maybe October, this is where we have 2 churches. And I want to magnify this history because it's from 1798 maybe to October, I would say to 1850, where we have the history. This is 1798, and maybe put October here, 1844, and this is where you'll realize that there is a transition between 2 churches, Sardis and Philadelphia. That's the history. And I want us to see that, remember why I came here, I want to prove something. So let's go back to the quote Sabina has read for us. So efforts, so he says, efforts must be redoubled in this gathering time. And then Ellen White is going to make a compare and a contrast. In the scattering, Israel is smitten and torn. So you can come to the scattering and show that in the scattering, this is the work of to tear and to smite. But in the history of gathering, what is going to happen? But now in the gathering time, God will heal and bind. This is the time to heal and to bind. Then in the scattering, efforts made to spread the truth have little effect or accomplish little or nothing. But in the gathering, when God has set his hand to gather his people, efforts to spread the truth have their designed effect. So I will not read because of time, but the most important thing you're going to realize is that there are characteristics that will guide you in a scattering time, and there are characteristics that will guide you in a scattering time. So, and interestingly, you will realize that when you come to the history of this church studies, there is a message. This is the message of time given to church studies. And this message of time is Daniel 8:14. And to 2,300 days, the sanctuary shall be cleansed. And what will church studies claim? And thus says the Lord. When you go to the book of Matthew, it is very clear. No one knows the day or the hour, not even Christ. And this doctrine, an erroneous doctrine from the papacy, temporal millennium, hinders them from seeing that God is testing them on time. So church studies has a characteristic of rejecting time. Now let's come to Laodicea. And I want us to see that Laodicea has the same characteristic. They reject a message of time. What is the most common prophecy that Adventists have a problem with? So let's come to this history. October 22nd to 1850. And we are saying the characteristics that will govern you in a history of gathering are the same characteristics that will govern you in a history of what? Gathering. So if this gathering one, we have characteristics here, and we are saying when you compare the history of gathering one and the history of gathering two and the history of gathering three, they all have the same characteristics. Because in gathering one, let me put it here very clear, we have G1, we have G2, and we have G3. So in the history of gathering one, this is 1798 to October 22nd. And from the history of 1798 to October, what we have is a message of time. This is the 2300 days time prophecy. Church studies reject this message. Let's come to gathering two, 1850, and I'm going to put the next mark, 1863. So from 1850 to 1863, what do we have? A gathering two. And I would suggest if gathering one, there is a message of time. In this history of gathering two, what you need to understand also is that there was a message of time. And what message was here? This is the message of Daniel 8:13. And what is the message of Daniel 8:13? It's about the two desolating powers who will tread underfoot the sanctuary and the host, each for a period of 1260. It's the 2520. And this is the work of William Miller in the 2300 days prophecy. But when you come to the 2520, who is commissioned with this work? It's Hiram Edison. He's the one who is required by the church in this period to give them a message. And by the way, you need to look at Hiram Edison, a very interesting character, because after the great disappointment in October 22nd, the first person to see a vision in heaven when they are walking on a field will be Hiram Edison. Actually, the Millerites, those who remained and those who actually had the guts to wait for the second coming in October, most of them had converged in Edison's farm. And it is here where Edison tells them, maybe he has delayed, let's go for a prayer. And walking on the field, it's Edison who is the first person to realize the position of Christ, shifting from the holy to the most holy place. Then you come to the year 1850s, and he's the one commissioned with the work of coming up with the study, the times of the Gentiles, concerning the two desolating powers of Daniel 8:13, the 2520 time prophecy. and you'll actually see this prophecy, as much as it brought a lot of arguments and disagreement in church, James White, the leader of the church, will eventually discard the time prophecy. And because it is deemed controversial, they will actually replace the 1843 chart and the 1850 charts, which have some controversial prophecies, with a counterfeit chart, the 1863 chart, which will omit actually the 2520, the time prophecy. So if you look at this history, Church Laodicea has a problem as Church Sardis. Number one, they all reject, they all claim to be hot but cold. They lie about their condition. They claim to be alive but dead. But Laodicea also has a problem. They reject a message of time. Such, the same thing with Sardis, they rejected a message of time. One, Sardis rejects Miller's message, the 2300 days time prophecy. Laodicea, the 2520. So you can actually see, when you come to G3, our gathering from 1989 to the second advent, you are going to see that there is also some bits. There must be a message of time. So the history that governs you in the characteristics that you see in the history of a gathering are the same characteristics you will see in all gatherings. And the same can be done for history of scattering. The same characteristics that govern scattering 1 are the same characteristics that will be seen. Let's do that. So scattering 1, and we have scattering 2 and scattering 3. And I will want first to demonstrate scattering 1 and scattering 3, because this is what my focus is. In scattering 1, what you have is Jezebel, who is doing a twofold work. She's a prophetess, so she's going to prophesy to the servants of the Lord, and she's also a teacher. She's going to be teaching the servants of the Lord. And in scattering 3, what you have are the daughters of Jezebel. So this is the history from 1863 to 1989. This is the history of 538 to 1798, scattering 1 and scattering 3. You can look at the characteristics. So we know that this is Catholicism doing a work in the Dark Ages, but in the history of the 126 years is Protestantism doing that work of teaching and seducing the Adventist leadership. So I hope we have two testimonies to establish that Laodicea is Church Sardis, and there are many characteristics actually. Sorry. The other important bit I want us to have is to realize that, again, Church Laodicea is the same as the Jewish church. And I will give you characteristics why they are the same. When you go to Church Laodicea, we have seen what they claim. They claim to be hot, but are cold. What is the problem with the Jewish church? When you go to the story of Matthew 23, I just want to go to the story of Matthew 23. And this is Christ's last words to the Jewish church. He begins by telling the people, whatever the Pharisees tell you, do it. That is what is in accordance to the law. They sit at Moses' seat to teach and execute or administer the law. So you need to obey them. But do not go after their ways, because Christ is going to call them hypocrites. And when you look at the entire story of Matthew 23, you will see that there are parallels. For Church Laodicea, what do they lack? They are blind. They are poor and miserable. And Christ is admonishing them to come and buy a piece of clothing because they are naked. Now look at the Jewish church. And look at the characteristics of the Jewish church. They claim to be clean because they are clean on the outside, but what are they actually? But they are actually dirty. This is in the inside. They claim to be like sepulchres who look decorated and desirable from without, but within is full of what? Bones. So this is the characteristic of the Jewish church. And from the accusations Christ will have to the Jewish church, he will accuse them of first the leaders, blind leaders, and they're actually leading blind people. So the Jewish church also is blind, just like the Laodicean church. When you come to the Beatitudes given to the Jewish kingdom, blessed are the poor. The Jewish church is poor in spirit, but the blessing is to those who realize their condition, because sorry, Christ will eventually make them rich. They are poor. And you will actually see the same characteristics of nakedness can be applied to them. They lack the righteousness of Christ. They lack the character of Christ. They don't even know how to treat a neighbor. So the piece of clothing is a character, it's associated with the character of God, the righteousness of God. So with this capacity, I would show that the Jewish church has the same problem as the Laodicean church. And the Jewish church will also reject a message of time. And now let me test this. John the Baptist has a message. Repent, for the kingdom of God is at what? At hand. The time is fulfilled. What is the time that tests the Jewish church? This is Lena. Lena, what's the message of time that the Jewish church will be tested with? Lena, you have an idea? Sorry. Okay, Robert. So for those who don't know, this is the 490 years, the 70 weeks. This prophecy points to the Messiah, the prince. So this prophecy points to the king. So when John says the kingdom of God is at hand, it's because the kingdom is at hand because the king is coming. So you can actually see that even the Jewish people, they don't know the time of their visitation. They don't actually understand it's their time. The 70 weeks allocated to the Hebrew people, Daniel's people, to the Jewish people, have now almost come to an end. When Christ's ministry begins, we are in the last week of the 70. 69 have ended. Really need to realize that. They really need to understand that. And because they don't understand time, they don't understand that this time predicted the coming of the Messiah, the coming of Christ. So they don't interpret anything significant with Christ doing. They ought to realize that this work of Christ, Christ's ministry, is the confirmation of the covenant that is spoken in Daniel 9:26 and 27. So you can actually see the characteristics. So with all that, this is the parallel I want us to see. So if you can equate the Laodicean with the Jewish church, and now this is why I said I want to begin at a basic level, and you can now really see I'm actually upgrading. So the first thing you need to see is that you can make an application of the 7 churches. That is the experiences. And the first one I want us to see is this one. That when you look at the Ephesus church, and this Ephesus is the church of the apostles, I'm suggesting as you look at church number 1, as you look at church number 1, which is the church Ephesus, you also really need to realize, so let me put it clear. So this is the first church, Ephesus. And as you look at church Ephesus, I'm suggesting you actually see if the Laodicean church is church number 7, I'm also suggesting the Jewish church would also be church number 7. So as you see church Ephesus, you also need to see the Jewish church, which is church number 7. So this is the church of the apostles. This is the new Christian church. And if this church is church number 1, then you need to see the Jewish church, church number 7. So what we came to a realization is that we can overlay the history of the churches. The experiences begin to overlap. And if you see this combination of 1, 7, and we are saying we have the church number 7 here as the Laodicean church, which is the Seventh-day Adventist church, then you need to see down here is church number 1, this movement, which is church Ephesus. So you can actually see there is a combination of 7, 1 when you look at these churches. And to justify that, if the Jewish church was church number 7, then you know there is a time the Jewish church was church number 1. And this is the history of the Jewish people in Mount Sinai in Moses' time. And how did they become church number 1? When they entered into a covenant with God, and God gave them the 2 tablets. And they said, all that the Lord has said, we will do what? We will do. And they entered into a marriage with God. Now, when you go to the story of Galatians chapter 3, we don't have time, but I would have gone there to demonstrate. There is an allegory there, a parable, and you will actually see that the story is about Abraham. Abraham, who has 2 wives, Hagar and Sarah. Hagar is the wife of, Hagar is the wife in bondage. Abraham has a woman who is in bondage. And so the seed of this woman, who is Ishmael, is also in bondage. Then there is the free woman, Sarah. And this child of Sarah is the child of promise. But there is a problem. Abraham cannot coexist with 2 wives. What must Abraham do? Cast out the bondwoman and marry or continue with this free woman. So there is a discarding of one woman and the retainment of another woman. It is the same story Paul uses to explain the coexistence of these 2 churches together. And the story continues. As Ishmael persecuted Isaac, Paul tells us that Hagar, the woman in bondage, is the Jewish church. And the Jewish church is persecuting this new Christian church, the church of promise. And so it's the same story here. This is the story of Galatians chapter 3. If I had time, I would have gone there to demonstrate. This is the first covenant and the second covenant. The first covenant is what Paul says, Mount Sinai. This is here when God covenants them and they become the wife of God. That's the parable. But here now, there is a divorce happening, casting out the bondwoman. And it's the same story in Matthew, because the last words of Christ in Matthew 23. So we have also read Matthew 23. We have now read Galatians chapter 3, chapter 4. So you will actually see the last words of Matthew 23. You shall not see me henceforth. That is after Christ rebukes the church and says, no stone shall stand upon another. The last words are, your house has been left to your own desolate. It's no longer my house, it's your house. The reason why Christ tells them, the Jewish church, your house, it's because Christ has now entered into an alliance, entered into a reunion, entered into a marriage with a new wife. Continuing to the story of Galatians 3, there is a rebuke. Rejoice to the barren, because the one who is the desolate woman, the Jewish church, has many more seeds than the newly married woman, the one with the husband. It's the same story. The Jewish church looked huge and big, and this was a contrast of what the new Christian church looked. So you can actually see, if you have this pattern, you can actually come to our history and say, if the Jewish church is the Laodicean church, then you actually need to see, when the Jewish church existed, the poor, blind, and naked existed a pure church, Church Ephesus. So in our history, if we have the Adventist church, the poor, blind, and naked, there ought to exist a pure church, which is this movement. And the Adventist church persecutes this movement. The same problem with Church Sardis. Church Sardis persecutes Philadelphia. Remember, we said Sardis is Laodicea. The Millerite movement, it was a movement. This movement, it is a movement. The church Ephesus, they didn't have houses. They were a movement. You can really see a lot of similarities actually. And you will see Sardis persecuted Philadelphia. The Millerites were persecuted by the Protestant churches who shut their doors to the message. So you can begin to see the experience of the churches begin to overlap. So this is the first thing. So you can look at the history and see Mount Sinai, the Jewish church had the experience of Ephesus. And you can carry on with the parallel. They had the experience of Smyrna in the history of the judges. They are persecuted by the Philistines and all these other kingdoms. In the experience of the third church, this is the time of the kings. Here, they compromise. The kings will erect pagan altars in Jerusalem. Compromise, truth and error. The fourth church, this is the 70 years in captivity, Babylon. And they repeat the history of church, the Atira, and etc., etc. So you can actually see the history of the churches make sense. So the other important parallel I want us to see is that when you come to this history again, and it's this history actually that I want us to see, and I want to redraw the pattern again. So I'm saying from October 22nd, 1844, and take us to 1850. This is the period of scattering. And then from 1850 to 1863 should have been the period of gathering. Then from 63 to 1989, instead of them being in a gathering, they ended up being scattered for 126 years. And then from 1989, I would say to the second advent, this is the history of a gathering. And I want us to see, in one perspective, Ellen White says, this is the beginning of the experience of Church Laodicea. And since the experience of the churches takes us until the end, and what the end Ellen White refers to is the second advent, the end of time, you're actually going to see that Church Laodicea takes us to the end. Right from 1850, we are in the experience of the seventh church, Church Laodicea. But you can begin to see an overlap. And this is the overlap. Come to 1850. And I want to quote a chapter in early writings. And in early writings, the chapter is covetousness. And what is the chapter talking about? The same history, 1850. Ellen White says that Satan has a problem. Satan has a discovery that we are able to control the world. We are able to do that through spiritualism. But there is a set of Sabbath keepers who we have a problem with. They are stealing subjects from us. How do they steal subjects from Satan's kingdom? Through the message they give. So let's do this. Let's allow them to continue professing what they will. Let them continue professing to be Sabbath keepers. Let them continue professing to be the keepers of the law. Whatever they profess, let them profess. But stop them from stealing our subject. Make them possessed with the cares of the world. Make them possessed with irrelevant things. And this is where covetousness comes. They covet the world. And when you approach that story or that chapter with the correct methodology, you will actually realize that Adventists are not made to love houses and cars. That what actually Adventists are meant to do is to reject the prophetic light, the prophetic message, the actual message that could heal the world, the actual message that could enable them to finish the work. And by doing that, they end up becoming this condition. So, and I will want us to see that this is a movement who has been given a mandate, a work to do. And what do they eventually do? They end up in a state of compromise. So I'm suggesting from 1850 to 1863, what the church actually does is to do what? To compromise. Instead of them being on the right path, they end up being a compromised church. And what church is the church of compromise? This is church Pergamos. I hope you can see that. This is church Pergamos. So from 1850 to 63, in one line of thinking, we are Laodicea. But in another line of thinking, what are we? Compromise. Then, because there is a cause and effect relationship, after Pergamos, from 63 to 1989, what do we have? This is church Thyatira, the church in the period of darkness. And this is why we say this 126 years from 1863 to 1989, it's a repeat of this history in the 1260. So what we see here is that the 1260 in the period of Thyatira will be the same as the 126 in this period here. So this is the period of darkness. And as the period of darkness ends in 1798, our period of darkness will end in 1989, which becomes a time of the end, time of the end. I hope you can see that. So, and when you come to 1989, then you can begin to see the church overlaps. So this was just a simple exercise. I know my time is almost up, but this is where I'm heading, and I think this is where we will pick in our next class. Because what I'm suggesting, we need to be able to come to a realization that as we understand where we are today, and I'm going to put it here, we are saying this is 1989, and I'm saying this is the close of probation. This is the Sunday law. This is 2001. And I'm saying we stand in this dispensation. I'm just giving a conclusive thought that we will be able to prove in our next class. If this is where we are, I'm suggesting we need to factor in the experience of the churches. I don't dispute we are in the history of Church Laodicea, but I'm saying the experience of the churches will repeat. And we will see parallels even drawn by Ellen White herself, that the Sunday law history, this period here, is the experience of Church Thyatira. Because in the first Thyatira, what did we have? The man of sin was revealed. It's the period where we had a union of church and state, and the church, through the powers of the state, was able to eliminate heretics, those who didn't agree with that ideology. So what we are saying is that in this history, the experience of church Thyatira will be repeated. And what we are going to have is the same character. Principally, we expect to see a man of sin. And this man of sin has the same dynamic. Today, it's not church and state. Today, it's culture and state. And from what culture the person possesses, through the powers of the state, we are going to see persecution. I will give an example. It is not an unusual thing. It's now becoming a common thing, what we see in America, where someone, because what culture dictates is that we cannot be the same based on our skin color, I would use the powers of the state to deport you illegally, even though you had acquired your documentation. I would deport you because I feel you're not fit in our country. These are the same dynamics we expect to see in this dispensation. So, and if this is church Thyatira, before church Thyatira, what do you expect to see? We just came out of the experience of Pergamos. So before the Sunday law, what we need to see is that there was a moment of compromise. Someone has to compromise to allow the man of sin to be revealed. So we need to look at the experience of Pergamos prior to 2024, which is the Sunday law, and look what compromises were made, and then come to this history and realize that we are actually repeating the history of church Thyatira. So in our next class, we will try to pick this concept and expound it. I just wanted to refresh on the history of the churches and some of the many concepts that we had. And now I'm saying we need to take that same concept of the churches and realize, as much as we look at the history internally, we can also look at the history externally. And I'm saying internally in the church and externally, we need to be able to explain this. I am more focused on the external because of the two examples I gave. You need to see that we are actually repeating the history of church Thyatira. And so, if you know this history of church Thyatira, I mean, what I'm saying is that you need to come back to this history of church Thyatira, understand all the characteristics of this church, and then realize we are repeating that history. So the dynamics of what happened internally and externally should be able to guide us to understand what is actually happening in this history here. So let me do a short recap, and then we will stop there, and then in our next class, we will pick the concept. So I began by looking at the history of the 7 churches. And I said, when you look at the history of the 7 churches, you need to overlay them with the history of the 7 seals. So the 7 churches explain the internal history of the church, how the church is doing things within. And the seals explain the external history of the church, how the church is interacting with the world, what is happening externally outside the church. And we looked at the 7 churches. These are literal churches in Asia, but it's a parable. They are used to explain the experience of one church, God's church, from when it begins to the end of time. This one church here will have its windings and turnings. That's what Miller says. And there are good things and bad things happening to the church. So it's one church in her 7 forms, in her 7 periods, in her 7 ages, in her 7 experiences, whatever you want to explain, in her 7 dispensations, all that is correct. So, and we saw that the names of the churches explain the experience of that church at that particular period. So when the church is called Ephesus, Ephesus means desirable. It's because this is a desirable church. This is depicted by the white horse, the church in its purity. The one on the horse has a bow and an arrow, who goes forth conquering and to conquer. The second church, Church Minor, the red horse, the church under persecution. The third church after persecution is the church under compromise. By the way, when you go to the Great Controversy, just looking at the chapters, you will actually realize that Ellen White gives us the chronological order and the experience of these churches. The first church is the first chapter of the Great Controversy, because the first chapter of the Great Controversy is the destruction of Jerusalem. This is the chapter that explains the birth of Christ, the ministry of Christ, all that period until 70 AD, when you have the destruction of Jerusalem. The second chapter is persecution in the first century. This is the church under persecution. So you can take the book Great Controversy. If I had a space on my boardwalk, I would have overlaid that. And you'll see that the first chapter, destruction of Jerusalem, is this experience of church Ephesus. Ellen White will explain to us what actually transpired to the laying of the foundation, work of John the Baptist, Christ taking the disciples of John, continuing the foundation, the church is complete, the disowning of the Jewish church, and the establishment of the new Christian church, which became the kingdom of God. And second chapter, persecution in the first century. And then that chapter, an era of spiritual darkness. This is the black horse, spiritual darkness. And then from there, what you will see, the other chapters, is from chapter 4 to chapter 18, if I'm not wrong. Chapter 18 is when we have William Miller. And you will see from chapter 4 to 17 is the history of Church Thyatira. It will speak to us of the dark days, the martyr. These martyrs here are crying because they were persecuted here. You'll have the history of Zwingli, the history of Jerome, John Huss, all these martyrs who will be executed because of their faith. And then you will have what we call the Protestant Reformation. People like Martin Luther, the Swiss reformer, the American reformers, all this trying to reform, trying to correct the Catholic Church with their own heresies and doctrines. And these are the people who will flee from this persecution and form church studies. So by the time you come to chapter 18 and you have the American reformer, and we mark the American reformer in 1798, then you can see Miller and his associates beginning to work, beginning to study. It's not only Miller who had the message. We had a character called Joseph Wolf, who ventured into Asian and other parts of Europe to take the gospel. But more focus is given to America, which is the epicenter of the message. So overlaying the Great Controversy gives you the experience of these churches, and you can actually understand better through the Great Controversy. So after looking at the history of the 7 churches, I say we need to realize that we can parallel some experiences together. Like I gave an example, Church Laodicea is the same as Church Sardis. This is the Adventist church, and they have the same character as the Protestant church. The Protestant church claimed to be alive, but they're actually dead. When the message of life was given in 1798, they continued to live in their dead state. They actually rejected a message on time, the message that could have given them life, the first angel's message. Adventists have the same problem. You can begin to trace their problem right from 1850s when they go into covetousness, when they actually give away the very same doctrines that made them a people. We have Edison's message, which becomes so controversial to a point where they discard it. Today, they have a gall of bitterness when they hear the term 2520, a message of time. So they have the same characteristic. And I also associated the Laodicean church with the Jewish church. Easier to see, same characteristic. And I'm saying, if you look at the comparison and say that the Laodicean church is church number 7, the Jewish church too can be equated as church number 7. And when you draw this structure, you can actually see if it's church number 7, you can walk backwards and look when the church had the experience of Ephesus. And so, if for the Jewish church, they are left to their own desolate, then you know the fate of Adventism. They are going to be spewed out of the mouth. They have the same characteristics. When you look at church number 7, you'll actually see there is church number 1. So the same characteristics, church number 1, church number 7, church number 7, church number 1. This is one of the justifications why we exist as a movement. This is one of the prophetic models we ought to give to anyone who questions our existence and the others. Then I say, when you come to this history, you realize, reading a quote, early writing 74.1, it opens up a very interesting pattern. the histories of gatherings and scatterings. It's 1850. Ellen White says that God has stretched his hand a second time to gather them. So if you want to know how God will gather them, what do? You compare the gatherings. Gathering 1, 2, and 3. In all the gatherings, it's a message of time. Gathering 1, the 2300 days, Daniel 8:14. Gathering 2, Daniel 8:13, the times of the Gentiles. And you come to our history, gathering 3, you know that there is a message of time. So all along, you can see that gatherings have the same characteristics. You come to the scattering, same characteristics. It's when Israel is torn and smitten. It's the same pattern. When you align the two, they work under the same principles. This was another proof why we had a message of time. Because people would ask, I come to early writing 74. This is the quote. When you go to 74 paragraph 2, what does paragraph 2 say? It speaks about the correct view of the daily. I was shown that the correct view of the daily was given to those who gave the judgment hour crime message. I'm just paraphrasing. And then she says that I was shown that time will not be what? A test. And the question was, this is Elder Tess here, this Elder Paminda here saying, this is a message of time. And the problem is, there is, thus says the prophet, no time setting, no more message on time. And what you need to do is to have this timeline. And look, why is the prophet standing? It's in 1850, and it's a moment of gathering. And when there is a moment of gathering, what must be there? Time. So when Ellen White says no time, it's because she stands in a history of what? Scattering, because there cannot be a message of time on a scattering. So when Ellen White in this history, 63 to 89, says you can't leave the church, even if the church is Laodicea, you can't leave it. You need to realize that in a history of scattering, you can't actually leave the church. Where would you go? It's only in a gathering time where you are told, come out of her. And you can compare that and see. 1798 to October, it's church service, and they are told to come out and go to Philadelphia. 1850 ought to have been another come out, which failed. So you come to our history, and you know there is a coming out from Laodicea. So this pattern has a lot of lessons it actually teaches us. And the most one that I saw or wanted to demonstrate was that when you come into this history, Sardis and Laodicea all reject time. And when they reject time, Laodicea, as much it's one experience, repeat another experience, compromise. They repeat the experience of Church Pergamos. And so from 1863 to 1989, they enter into the period of Church Thyatira. So it's still Laodicea, but they are going under Thyatira. And you can mark from 1989, it's still Laodicea, but what do we have? Experience of Church Ephesus. So this justification gives me a license to bring my concept here, that we are still in Laodicea. We are still in the experience of the seventh church. But I'm saying we are repeating the experiences again in our dispensation. From the Sunday law to the close of probation, we need to see the experience of Church Thyatira. And before Thyatira, there must be the experience of Church Pergamos, because we understand this dynamic. Compromise to this history. And when you come to Church Thyatira, one important lesson you need to learn is that this time it's the work of God. And what does God do? Punish. So, and we are going to see it more clearly when you now link it to the studies that Elder Paminda has been doing, that the sixth kingdom, that America in reality is punished. This is the history of the external. I don't know how we would explain about the internal, but I hope there ought to be an argument to show the punishment of Adventism. Because from the Sunday law, this period, if we are repeating the experience of the Thyatira, both internally and externally, in this history of the Thyatira, because of this compromise and going into the experience of the Thyatira, there is a punishment from God. So we need to look at the Sunday law to the close of probation and ask ourselves, what is this punishment that is taking place? What is the sin? We know that in our history, internally, we look at internally, Most of the times we look at Adventists, and externally, we look at USA. And I'm going to suggest we need to see this punishment. This is the story of the ship. The ship has wrecked, and there are consequences. So in our next class, we will try to address all these issues. So I don't know whether anyone has a question or a comment. You can raise your hand. Actually, didn't see people raising their hands. So if you raised your hand and I didn't see, you have a chance before I end up my class. Anyone? Okay, so I will end there, and I will invite you for a closing prayer. So let us
Okay.
pray. Yes.
Another request. Boardwalk.
No problem. I'll post the boardwork. So let us pray. Almighty God, we are grateful for this wonderful moment that we have come together to share and discuss your word. We are grateful for reviewing our mindset and trying to remember the old truths that for so long have been buried. But it's by going back and closely examining those truths that we actually see a path, and we actually realize that you want us to learn what is our experience today. Continue refreshing our minds, continue giving us the old memories of the truths we recited and sang for so long without really understanding that it's now the time of their fulfillment. Be with us until our next class. As you go to rest, we pray for everyone as rest well until tomorrow when we converge to the Sabbath meetings for those who have online and physical. Until the Sabbath ends, God, we will honor and glorify your name. I pray this, believing and trusting in Jesus' name. Amen.